from the Elsie Bates Museum. Good afternoon. Welcome to Nature Nuggets. And today's Nature Nuggets is actually a series of Nature Nuggets. We're going to be talking about reptiles. And I'm going to do a series of videos about each group of reptile. And before we do that, I think it's important that we talk about what makes a reptile a reptile. What are some of the characteristics and features that they share that separate them from other groups of animals and make their group unique. So, number one, reptiles are vertebrates. And if you don't know what a vertebrate is, I want you to reach behind your back and touch your spine, okay? And feel along your spine. And if you feel those little bumps, those are your vertebrae. And your vertebrae make up your backbone. So if you're a vertebrate, you have vertebrae, you have a backbone. So when we say all reptiles are vertebrates, we mean they all have a backbone. And we can actually look here, and we can see the backbone of the snake and the ribs. And of course, there's the skull. Now, animals that do not have a backbone, we call those invertebrates. But all reptiles are vertebrates, so that's number one. The second thing, the second feature I should say that we're going to talk about are all reptiles are what we call cold-blooded. Now, I'm going to use that term cold-blooded for right now because that's probably one that you're more familiar with. In a second, I'm going to teach you guys a better, more accurate word for that because cold-blooded can be a little bit misleading. It doesn't mean that their blood is actually cold. What it means is that they do not use energy to regulate their own body temperature. Their body temperature is kind of dependent on the environment that they're in. That's why if you're out on a warm day, you might see a bunch of turtles all sitting out on a log in the water. They're basking in the sun. They're using the sunlight to warm themselves up so that their bodies can be awake and full of energy, and they have the capability to go look for food and do other things that they need to do. So animals like mammals, like birds, us, we're mammals. We're what we call warm-blooded. That means that we use energy to keep our bodies at a certain temperature or around a certain temperature. So like if we were to go out on kind of a chilly day, our bodies are going to work to keep our temperature higher. That's why, we start to shiver a little bit if we get too cold. That's our body working to regulate our temperature and keep it as steady as possible. So that takes quite a bit of energy to do. Reptiles, since they don't do that, they need to eat far less than we do. They don't spend all that energy doing that. But the flip side is that they are dependent on their environment, the sun, to warm up. And on colder days, or before they warm up, they're kind of sluggish and can be vulnerable. So a better word for cold-blooded, a more scientific word, is to say ectothermic. So ecto means outside, and thermic is referring to temperature. Warm-blooded animals are called endothermic. So we are endothermic. Endo means inside. We regulate our temperature on the inside. So ectothermic is one of your vocabulary words for today. All right. So something else that all reptiles have in common is they all have scales or some form of scales. So this is a snake skin. This belongs to rattlesnake, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But all reptiles have scales as opposed to amphibians. Amphibians are things like frogs and salamanders, and a lot of times they get confused because they're both cold-blooded or ectothermic. But amphibians have smoother skin. It needs to be kept moist, which is why they're found more near water. Reptiles are covered in scales. Their skin tends to be rougher, and they aren't necessarily dependent on being around water. So even reptiles that spend a lot of time in the water, like our turtles still have some form of scales. Yeah, and a lot of times our turtles get confused with amphibians because they spend so much time in the water. But the reason they are not considered amphibians, or one of the reasons I should say, is turtles lay their eggs on land. All reptiles lay their eggs on land, and they have kind of a shell to protect them. It's not quite like a chicken's shell, it's more leathery. So even turtles like sea turtles, this is a diagram of sea turtles. They spend most of their life in the water, except for when the females come up on land. So even though they spend all this time in the water, they'll still come to the beach to lay eggs. And then alligators, as well, is another reptile that spends a lot of time in the water, but they lay their eggs on land. And the reason they're able to do this is because they have this shell. So if you think about frog eggs, if you've ever seen them, they look like just little jelly blobs, little jelly eyeballs in the water. And they don't have a protective shell to keep them from drying out, to hold the moisture in. So amphibians are dependent on wet environments or very, very moist environments in order to lay their eggs. Reptiles evolved this eggshell, which allowed them to take advantage and lay their eggs on land. So we've talked about reptiles are vertebrates, which means they have a backbone. We talked about reptiles are ectothermic, which means they are dependent on their environment to regulate their temperature. Reptiles have scales, and they lay their eggs on land. So those are 4 defining characteristics of reptiles, and in our next videos we're going to be talking about the different groups of reptiles. All right, see you guys in a few minutes.